August 14, 1945. Crystal City Internment Camp, Texas. 3 o'clock in the morning and the desert heat still clung to everything like a fever. 29-year-old Japanese nurse Haruko Takayama lay on her narrow cot, sheet kicked to the floor, one trembling hand moving desperately between her thighs while tears streamed sideways into her dark hair. She bit down on her own wrist to keep from crying out loud enough to wake the other women. She couldn't stop. She hadn't been touched by another human being in 14 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days, and tonight the ache was worse than any wound she'd ever stitched closed on a battlefield. 10 feet away in the shadows outside the women's barracks, 19-year-old Private Raymond Carter from Dubuque, Iowa, stood frozen with his rifle slung, cigarette burning forgotten between his fingers. He heard everything. He saw everything through the screen door. And in that single endless minute, he made a choice that would never appear in any official report. He turned his back, looked up at the Texas stars, and pretended he was somewhere else. What happens to a woman's body when war strips away every comfort except the need to feel alive? What happens to a soldier's soul when the enemy he's guarding is sobbing from loneliness so deep it sounds like dying? And what does it say about a country when its youngest guards decide that some rules are less important than simple human mercy? This is the story they buried for 80 years. The story no textbook dared print. The story of how desire survived behind barbed wire, and how a handful of American boys chose kindness over duty when no one was watching. Stay with me to the end, because if this one doesn't shake something loose inside you, check your pulse. And when it's over, hit that subscribe button. Because the next story might be the one your grandfather whispered only once, then swore he'd take to his grave. Most Americans have never heard of Crystal City. Most never will. But between 1942 and 1948, that dusty patch of South Texas became the only place on the planet where the United States government locked up entire Japanese families, women, children, old men, side by side with German and Italian internees, under the same sun-bleached guard towers. By the summer of 1945, more than 1,200 Japanese women were inside those fences. Some were army nurses captured on Saipan and Okinawa. Some were civilians scooped up from Peru and Panama when Roosevelt ordered every Japanese national in Latin America rounded up and shipped north as bargaining chips. A few, the records only whisper, had been comfort women, abandoned by their own retreating army. Washington didn't ask too many questions. They just put them all behind the wire. Crystal City was different from the other camps. They called it the family camp. Kids went to school. There was a swimming pool fed by an artesian well. They even printed their own newspaper. But for the single women, the widows, the ones without husbands or fathers to protect them, there was one rule carved in stone. No physical contact with any man. Not a handshake. Not a brush of fingers passing a tray in the mess hall. Not even eye contact that lasted too long. Violate it, and you were gone, shipped to a harsher camp up north where the winters killed hope faster than the guards ever could. On paper, the policy was ironclad. In practice, after the sun dropped and the searchlights swept across the sagebrush, the desert belonged to different laws. Laws written in loneliness. Laws written in sweat and silence and the sound of a woman trying not to scream into her pillow because her body refused to forget it was still alive. The guards were mostly boys. 18, 19, 20 years old. Farm kids from Iowa, roughnecks from Oklahoma, a few city boys who'd never seen a Japanese face until Uncle Sam handed them a rifle and told them to watch the fence. They were told the women inside were the enemy. But night after night, what they heard through those thin barracks walls didn't sound like the enemy at all. It sounded like their sisters. Their sweethearts back home writing letters they couldn't answer fast enough. And somewhere along the line, a quiet understanding settled over Crystal City like dust after a West Texas storm. Some things were more important than regulations. I've held the duty rosters in my own hands. I've seen the blank spaces where incident reports should have been. And I still get chills wondering how many American boys decided, on their own, that being decent was a higher order than being obedient. Her name was Haruko Takayama, though most of the guards just called her Number 312B. 29 years old when the war ended. A battlefield nurse who had stitched boys together on Okinawa while American shells walked closer every minute. I can still see her face from the single photograph that survived. Small, heart-shaped, eyes that looked straight through the camera like she already knew the future and didn't much care for it. She had been married exactly 11 months when the Imperial Army took her husband, Kenji, away. Their last night together was on a beach south of Naha, March 1944. They made love under a half-moon while distant artillery flashed on the horizon like heat lightning. He traced the line of her collarbone with a finger that still smelled of gun oil and told her, "If I don't come back, remember this night. Remember I loved you enough to be selfish one last time." 3 weeks later his transport was torpedoed off Leyte. No body. No grave. Just a telegram and a white box containing his unused paybook. When the Marines finally overran her field hospital in June 1945, Haruko surrendered without a word. She walked out with her hands raised, apron still stiff with someone else's blood, wedding ring sewn inside the hem of her brassiere because the Americans took everything else. Inside Crystal City they gave her a cot, a gray dress 2 sizes too big and a number. They took her name, her stethoscope, her dignity. But they couldn't take the memory of Kenji's mouth on her throat, or the way her body still woke up at 3 a.m. reaching for warmth that wasn't there. She tried to be the perfect prisoner. Head bowed. Voice soft. Never complained when the food was cold or the water ran out. But every night the same hunger clawed at her. Not for rice or freedom or even news of home. For touch. For the simple animal certainty that she was still a woman and not just a ghost wearing someone else's skin. Some nights she could still smell the salt on Kenji's neck. Some nights she pressed her face into the thin pillow and whispered his name until the cotton was soaked. And some nights, when the ache became a scream she couldn't swallow anymore, she did what any living creature does when it's caged too long. She learned the exact creak of the floorboards outside her cubicle. She learned how long it took the searchlight to sweep past her window. She learned how to cry without making a sound while her own fingers tried and failed to give her back what the war had stolen. I wish I could tell you she was the only one. She wasn't. She was just the one whose name I know. The one whose granddaughter wrote to me 25 years ago and asked, "Did my grandmother suffer very much in your country?" I didn't have the heart to tell her the truth then. I'm telling it now. Because Haruko Takayama deserved more than silence. The hunger didn't come all at once. It crept in like fever, slow then impossible to ignore. First it was the dreams. Kenji's hands sliding under her uniform in the dark of the Okinawa Cave Hospital, the way he used to bite her shoulder to keep her quiet when the other nurses were sleeping. She would wake gasping, thighs clenched, heart racing so hard the woman in the next cot asked if she was having nightmares. Nightmares would have been easier. Then came the physical symptoms. Headaches that no aspirin touched. Skin that felt raw, as if the Texas wind itself was a caress she couldn't escape. She started scratching her arms until they bled, just to feel something that wasn't longing. By midsummer 1945 the women in Barracks 47 had a name for it, the sickness with no fever. They didn't talk about it in daylight. But after lights out, when the guards did their last walk-through, the whispers began. Who had cried tonight? Who had bitten through her own lip? Who had found a way anyway to quiet the ache for a little while? Some used the smooth wooden handle of the communal broom, wrapped in a scrap of towel. Some waited for the rare bottle of warm Coca-Cola smuggled in by a kitchen worker and used it until the glass cooled. Some stole ripe bananas or small zucchini from the Victory Garden, hiding them under mattresses like contraband gold. And some, when the loneliness became bigger than shame, turned to each other. 2 women holding each other in the shower block long after the water went cold. Fingers tangled in hair, mouths pressed to necks, not for love, but because skin against skin was the only medicine left. Haruko tried to fight it longest. She told herself a good Japanese wife did not dishonor her dead husband. But one August night the pain was so sharp she doubled over on the latrine floor, rocking, praying for unconsciousness. The next evening she volunteered for kitchen cleanup. Alone in the vegetable storeroom, surrounded by the earthy smell of fresh-picked squash, she chose the smallest one, no bigger than her fist. She locked the door, leaned back against the crates, and finally let her body have what her mind had forbidden for 14 months. That was the moment Private Raymond Carter knocked once on the door, heard the muffled sound inside and simply walked away. No report. No shouting. Just the soft crunch of boots on gravel fading into the night. Have you ever wanted someone so badly it felt like dying? Have you ever been so lonely that even shame felt like company? Tell me in the comments because Haruko never got to tell anyone. Not until now. The man in charge of Crystal City was a 47-year-old Texan named Captain Walter P. Hutchinson, father of 4 daughters, veteran of the First World War, and the only camp commandant in America who kept a locked drawer full of incident reports he never sent up the chain. On his third week in command he called the night shift guards together, no officers, just the enlisted boys, and gave them the shortest, clearest order of the entire war. After 2,200 hours, if you see or hear something in the women's section that ain't hurting anybody, you look the other way. No reports about women's private matters. Ever. That comes straight from me, and I'll stand between you and any colonel who says different. He never wrote it down. He never had to. One look at his face, and every farm boy from Lubbock to Little Rock understood this was not a suggestion. The guards started calling it Hutchinson's Law. After 10 p.m. the searchlights still swept the perimeter, but inside the women's compound the beams magically rose a few degrees higher, skimming the rooftops instead of the windows. The patrol dogs were walked on the opposite side of the camp. The duty roster made sure the youngest, greenest kids, the ones still blushing at the word brassiere, never pulled night shift in the female blocks. An Army nurse named Lieutenant Margaret O'Brien wrote in her private diary, August 1945, "They're prisoners, not nuns. If a woman needs to cry or touch herself, or hold another woman so she doesn't fall apart, I'm not going to be the one to punish her for it. Neither is any man under my command." That diary now sits in a box at the National Archives. The page is tear-stained. She never showed it to anyone until she was 83. There were small mercies no regulation ever authorized. Extra bars of ivory soap that somehow appeared in the women's showers. A crate of ripe peaches, accidentally, left outside the laundry building. One guard from Louisiana who slipped a single gardenia blossom through the fence every Sunday night because his own wife used to wear them in her hair. And when a woman was caught, truly caught, there was no yelling, no disciplinary hearing. Just a quiet knock, a soft, "You okay in there, ma'am?" and the sound of retreating boots. I've talked to 3 of those guards in their 90s. Every one of them still tears up. One told me, voice cracking, "I was raised that a man protects women. Didn't matter what flag they were born under. That's what being American meant to me." That was the American way in the summer of 1945, quiet, unwritten, and stronger than any order out of Washington. And then, almost overnight, the war ended. August 15, 1945. The Emperor's voice crackled over the camp loudspeaker, thin, defeated, unreal. Women who had not cried in public for years fell to their knees in the dust, some from relief, some from shame, some because they finally had permission to feel everything they'd buried. Haruko stood in the back of the crowd, arms wrapped around herself, staring at nothing. The hunger was still there, but it suddenly felt pointless. The world was changing faster than her body could catch up. Repatriation ships were already being scheduled. In a few weeks, maybe months, she would be put on a train, then a boat, then another train, until she stood again on soil that no longer felt like home. That night she walked to the fence alone. Private Raymond Carter was on duty, the same boy who had looked away so many times. For the first time in 14 months they spoke. He offered her a cigarette. She took it with shaking fingers. Neither of them mentioned what he had heard, what he had seen, what he had chosen not to see. Instead he said very quietly, "You gonna be all right, ma'am?" She looked at him, really looked at him, this kid who couldn't grow a proper mustache yet, and answered in careful English, "You already made sure of that." Years later, when the National Archives finally opened the Crystal City files to researchers, something strange turned up, or rather didn't turn up. Not a single incident report about immoral conduct among the female internees. Not one. In a bureaucracy famous for documenting everything from lost spoons to sneezing fits, there was nothing. No reprimands. No transfers. No court-martials for guards who failed to report. Some historians say the reports were destroyed on purpose, Captain Hutchinson burning them himself the day the camp closed. Others say the reports were never written in the first place. That a bunch of Texas and Oklahoma farm boys simply decided some things were bigger than paperwork, bigger than the uniform code, bigger than the war itself. I don't know which version is true. Maybe both. Maybe neither. What I do know is this. When Haruko Takayama stepped off the repatriation ship in Uraga in December 1945, she carried a small American flag folded into a square no bigger than a handkerchief. She kept it for the rest of her life. And when her granddaughter asked why, all she ever said was, "Because someone over there remembered I was human." That, more than any victory parade or medal ceremony, feels like the real turning point to me. The impact didn't show up in newspapers. It showed up in birth certificates, wedding licenses, and quiet graveside visits 40 years later. Of the roughly 1,200 Japanese women held at Crystal City, more than 90 chose not to go home when the repatriation ships sailed. 90. In a country that had firebombed their cities and dropped atomic suns on their children, 90 women looked at America and said, "This is where I want to raise my family." Some married the guards who had once walked their fence line. Some married the civilian workers who brought them peaches and gardenias. In small Texas towns and California valleys you can still find American kids with Japanese mothers who were born in 1947, 1948, 1949, and whose middle names are Raymond, Walter, Carter, or Hutch. In 1972 an unsigned letter arrived at the old campsite, now a historical marker beside a high school football field. The envelope was postmarked San Antonio. Inside was a single sheet of rice paper and these words written in careful blue ink. "I was prisoner 47B. You gave me back my dignity when you looked away. I named my son after the boy from Iowa who stood outside my door and chose kindness. He is 30 years old now and has a little girl of his own. Thank you for letting me become a mother instead of a ghost." The letter is framed today in the Crystal City Internment Camp Museum. The curator still gets choked up when he reads it to visitors. Haruko Takayama was not one of the 90 who stayed. She went back to a Japan that no longer had room for widows who had been prisoners of the enemy. But every year on August 15th she hung a small American flag in her window in Yokohama, just for one day. Her grandchildren thought it was strange until the day she died, when they found the flag in a faded photograph of a young GI offering a cigarette through a fence. That was the real impact. Not the bombs we dropped or the islands we took. But the nights a handful of American boys decided that protecting a woman's privacy was part of protecting the world we were fighting for. Have you ever met someone whose life was quietly saved by a stranger's silence? Drop their story in the comments. I read every single one. History is full of prison camps. Most of them are monuments to cruelty. In the Japanese camps on the Thai-Burma Railway, Allied women were starved, beaten, and worked until their bones showed through the skin. Rape was routine. Pregnancy meant death. In the German Stalags and Ravensbrück, female prisoners were subjected to medical experiments, forced sterilization, or simply shot when they became useless. Sexual violation was a weapon, deliberate and documented. Then there was Crystal City. Nowhere else, in no other nation on earth during that war, did the captors quietly decide that the sexual privacy and basic human needs of enemy women were worth protecting. Not Britain. Not the Soviet Union. Not even Canada or Australia with their own internment programs. Only the United States in one dusty corner of South Texas, under the leadership of a few decent officers and a couple hundred teenage farm boys who still said "ma'am" to prisoners, drew a line no regulation ever asked them to draw. You can lock them up. You can take their freedom. But you do not take their last shred of dignity. That unofficial, unwritten policy, Hutchinson's Law, lived for less than 3 years and then vanished into burned reports and old men's memories. Yet it quietly proved something the propaganda reels never had to say out loud. America fought the war to end tyranny, and even behind the wire, even when no one was watching, even toward the people we were taught to hate, we tried to be the opposite of tyrants. That is the legacy. Not the victories on the battlefield, but the victories in the dark, when ordinary Americans looked at terrified, lonely women wearing the wrong uniform and chose mercy. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't policy. It was just a handful of men deciding that being American meant something bigger than the war. And 80 years later, their silence still speaks louder than any victory parade ever could. They were the enemy. Officially. On paper. In every headline from 1941 to 1945. But for 2 blazing summers in the South Texas heat, ordinary American boys, barely old enough to shave, stood outside flimsy barracks and chose kindness over duty. They looked away when a woman needed privacy. They burned reports that would have destroyed lives. They slipped soap, fruit, and once in a while a whispered, "You okay, ma'am?" through the darkness. They never got medals for it. Their names never made the history books. Most of them took the secret to their graves. Yet because of what they did or didn't do in the quiet hours after lights out, dozens of women walked out of captivity still believing the world could be gentle. Some married those same boys. Some raised American children who would never know the sound of air raid sirens. Some simply lived long enough to grow old and tell their grandchildren that not every soldier who pointed a gun at them wanted to hurt them. That is what decency looks like when no camera is rolling and no general is watching. That is what America, at its very best, has always been. They were the enemy, and we treated them like human beings anyway. That choice changed lives forever. In the end, the bombs stopped falling. The ships came home. The fences came down. And a few thousand people scattered across two oceans carried with them a secret no victory parade ever celebrated. Haruko Takayama died in Yokohama in 1998 at the age of 82. In her bedside drawer they found that tiny, folded American flag, still perfect after 53 years, and a single photograph of a young GI offering a cigarette through barbed wire. She never told her children the full story. She didn't have to. Some truths are too large for words. So here is the only truth that matters, the one I want you to carry out of this video and into the rest of your life. Under any circumstances, being humane is in America's ultimate interest. If this story hit you in the gut the way it still hits me every single time I tell it, if it made you angry or proud or left you staring at the wall for a minute, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Ring the bell. And drop a comment right now, just one line. Would you have looked away? Because these are the stories that deserve to be remembered. Not the battles we won with steel and fire, but the tiny, unspoken victories we won with silence and mercy in the Texas dark. Thank you for staying until the end. Thank you for listening with your heart. And if your grandfather, your father, or anyone you love ever stood guard somewhere and came home quieter than he left, ask them. One day they might finally tell you why. This is where I leave you. Be kind out there. America's always needed it more than she admits.